stopping by Sheila's Audiobooks, and I am Sheila. This recording is coming from South Texas. All stories on this recording are in the public domain per United States copyright law. This story is about Hastings is sent back to England from the First World War due to injury and is invited to spend his sick leave at the beautiful Styles Court by his old friend John Cavendish. Here, Hastings meets John's stepmother, Mrs. Inglethorp, and her new husband, Alfred. Despite the tranquil surroundings, Hastings begins to realize that all is not right. When Mrs. Inglethorp is found poisoned, suspicion falls on the family, and another old friend, Hercule Poirot, is invited to investigate. Manning came slowly and hesitatingly through the French window, and stood as near it as he could. He held his cap in his hands, twisting it very carefully round and round. His back was much bent, though he was probably not as old as he looked, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent, and belied his slow and rather cautious speech. "Manning," said John, "this gentleman will put some questions to you which I want you to answer." "Yes, sir," mumbled Manning. Poirot stepped forward briskly. Manning's eye swept over him with a faint contempt. "You were planting a bed of begonias round by the south side of the house yesterday afternoon, were you not, Manning?" "Yes, sir, me and Willem." "And Mrs. Inglethorp came to the window and called you, did she not?" "Yes, sir, she did." "Tell me in your own words exactly what happened after that." "Well, sir, nothing much. She just told Willem to go on his bicycle down to the village, and bring back a form of will, or such like, I don't know what exactly, she wrote it down for him." Well, he did, sir." "And what happened next?" "We went on with the begonias, sir." "Did not Mrs. Inglethorp call you again?" "Yes, sir, both me and Willem, she called." "And then?" "She made us come right in, and sign our names at the bottom of a long paper, under where she'd signed." "Did you see anything of what was written above her signature?" asked Poirot sharply. "No, sir, there was a bit of blotting paper over that part." "And you signed where she told you?" "Yes, sir, first me and then Willem." "What did she do with it afterwards?" "Well, sir, she slipped it into a long envelope, and put it inside a sort of purple box that was standing on the desk." "What time was it when she first called you?" "About 4, I should say, sir." "Not earlier? Couldn't it have been about 3:30? "No, I shouldn't say so, sir. It would be more likely to be a bit after 4, not before it." "Thank you, Manning, that will do," said Poirot pleasantly. The gardener glanced at his master, who nodded, whereupon Manning lifted a finger to his forehead with a low mumble, and backed cautiously out of the window. We all looked at each other. "Good heavens!" murmured John. "What an extraordinary coincidence." "How a coincidence?" "That my mother should have made a will on the very day of her death." Mr. Wells cleared his throat and remarked dryly, "Are you so sure it is a coincidence, Cavendish?" "What do you mean?" "Your mother, you tell me, had a violent quarrel with someone yesterday afternoon." "What do you mean?" cried John again. There was a tremor in his voice, and he had gone very pale. "In consequence of that quarrel, your mother very suddenly and hurriedly makes a new will. The contents of that will we shall never know. She told no one of its provisions. This morning, no doubt, she would have consulted me on the subject, but she had no chance. The will disappears, and she takes its secret with her to her grave. Cavendish, I much fear there is no coincidence there. Monsieur Poirot, I am sure you agree with me that the facts are very suggestive." "Suggestive, or not," interrupted John, "we are most grateful to Monsieur Poirot for elucidating the matter. But for him, we should never have known of this will. I suppose, I may not ask you, Monsieur, what first led you to suspect the fact?" Poirot smiled and answered, "A scribbled-over old envelope, and a freshly planted bed of begonias." John, I think, would have pressed his questions further, but at that moment the loud purr of a motor was audible, and we all turned to the window as it swept past. "Evie!" cried John. Excuse me, Wells. He went hurriedly out into the hall. Poirot looked inquiringly at me. Miss Howard, I explained. Ah, I am glad she has come. There is a woman with a head and a heart too, Hastings. Though the good God gave her no beauty. I followed John's example, and went out into the hall, where Miss Howard was endeavouring to extricate herself from the voluminous mass of veils that enveloped her head. As her eyes fell on me, a sudden pang of guilt shot through me. This was the woman who had warned me so earnestly, and to whose warning I had, alas, paid no heed. How soon, and how contemptuously, I had dismissed it from my mind. Now that she had been proved justified in so tragic a manner, I felt ashamed. She had known Alfred Inglethorp only too well. I wondered whether, if she had remained at Styles, the tragedy would have taken place, or would the man have feared her watchful eyes? I was relieved when she shook me by the hand, with her well-remembered painful grip. The eyes that met mine were sad, but not reproachful. That she had been crying bitterly, I could tell by the redness of her eyelids, but her manner was unchanged from its old gruffness. Started the moment I got the wire. Just come off night duty. Hired car. Quickest way to get here. Have you had anything to eat this morning, Evie? Asked John. No. I thought not. Come along, breakfast's not cleared away yet, and they'll make you some fresh tea. He turned to me. Look after her, Hastings, will you? Wells is waiting for me. Oh, here's Monsieur Poirot. He's helping us, you know, Evie. Miss Howard shook hands with Poirot, but glanced suspiciously over her shoulder at John. What do you mean helping us? Helping us to investigate. Nothing to investigate. Have they taken him to prison yet? Taken who to prison? Who? Alfred Inglethorp, of course. My dear Evie, do be careful. Lawrence is of the opinion that my mother died from heart seizure. More fool, Lawrence, retorted Miss Howard. Of course Alfred Inglethorp murdered poor Emily as I always told you he would. My dear Evie, don't shout so. Whatever we may think or suspect, it is better to say as little as possible for the present. The inquest isn't until Friday. Not until fiddlesticks. The snort Miss Howard gave was truly magnificent. You're all off your heads. The man will be out of the country by then. If he's any sense, he won't stay here tamely and wait to be hanged. John Cavendish looked at her helplessly. I know what it is, she accused him. You've been listening to the doctors. Never should. What do they know? Nothing at all, or just enough to make them dangerous. I ought to know. My own father was a doctor. That little Wilkins is about the greatest fool that even I have ever seen. Heart seizure. Sort of thing he would say. Anyone with any sense could see at once that her husband had poisoned her. I always said he'd murder her in her bed, poor soul. Now he's done it. And all you can do is to murmur silly things about heart seizure and inquest on Friday. You ought to be ashamed of yourself, John Cavendish. What do you want me to do? Asked John, unable to help a faint smile. Dash it all, Evie, I can't haul him down to the local police station by the scruff of his neck. Well, you might do something. Find out how he did it. He's a crafty beggar. Dare say he soaked fly papers. Ask Cook if she's missed any. It occurred to me very forcibly at that moment that to harbour Miss Howard and Alfred Inglethorp under the same roof, and keep the peace between them, was likely to prove a Herculean task, and I did not envy John. I could see by the expression of his face that he fully appreciated the difficulty of the position. For the moment, he sought refuge in retreat, and left the room precipitately. Dorcas brought in fresh tea. As she left the room, Poirot came over from the window where he had been standing, and sat down facing Miss Howard. Mademoiselle, he said gravely, I want to ask you something. Ask away, said the lady, eyeing him with some disfavor. I want to be able to count upon your help. I'll help you to hang Alfred with pleasure, she replied gruffly. Hanging's too good for him, ought to be drawn and quartered, like in good old times. We are at one then, said Poirot, for I, too, want to hang the criminal. Alfred Inglethorp? Him, or another? No question of another. Poor Emily was never murdered until he came along. I don't say she wasn't surrounded by sharks, she was. But it was only her purse they were after. Her life was safe enough. But along comes Mr. Alfred Inglethorp, and within 2 months, hey presto. Believe me, Miss Howard, said Poirot very earnestly, if Mr. Inglethorp is the man, he shall not escape me. On my honour, I will hang him as high as Haman. That's better, said Miss Howard more enthusiastically. But I must ask you to trust me. Now your help may be very valuable to me. I will tell you why. Because, in all this house of mourning, yours are the only eyes that have wept. Miss Howard blinked, and a new note crept into the gruffness of her voice. If you mean that I was fond of her, yes, I was. You know, Emily was a selfish old woman in her way. She was very generous, but she always wanted a return. She never let people forget what she had done for them, and, that way she missed love. Don't think she ever realized it, though, or felt the lack of it. Hope not, anyway. I was on a different footing. I took my stand from the first. So many pounds a year I'm worth to you. Well and good. But not a penny piece besides, not a pair of gloves, nor a theatre ticket. She didn't understand, was very offended sometimes. Said I was foolishly proud. It wasn't that, but I couldn't explain. Anyway, I kept my self-respect. And so, out of the whole bunch, I was the only one who could allow myself to be fond of her. I watched over her. I guarded her from the lot of them, and then a glib-tongued scoundrel comes along, and pooh! All my years of devotion go for nothing. Poirot nodded sympathetically. I understand, mademoiselle, I understand all you feel. It is most natural. You think that we are lukewarm, that we lack fire and energy, but trust me, it is not so. John stuck his head in at this juncture, and invited us both to come up to Mrs. Inglethorpe's room, as he and Mr. Wells had finished looking through the desk in the boudoir. As we went up the stairs, John looked back to the dining-room door, and lowered his voice confidentially. Look here, what's going to happen when these two meet? I shook my head helplessly. I've told Mary to keep them apart if she can. Will she be able to do so? The Lord only knows. There's one thing, Inglethorpe himself won't be too keen on meeting her. You've got the keys still, haven't you, Poirot? I asked, as we reached the door of the locked room. Taking the keys from Poirot, John unlocked it, and we all passed in. The lawyer went straight to the desk, and John followed him. My mother kept most of her important papers in this dispatch case, I believe, he said. Poirot drew out the small bunch of keys. Permit me. I locked it, out of precaution, this morning. But it's not locked now. Impossible. See. And John lifted the lid as he spoke. Milles tonnerres! Cried Poirot, dumbfounded. And I, who have both the keys in my pocket. He flung himself upon the case. Suddenly he stiffened. Et voilà une affaire. This lock has been forced. What? Poirot laid down the case again. But who forced it? Why should they? When? But the door was locked? These exclamations burst from us disjointedly. Poirot answered them categorically, almost mechanically. Who? That is the question. Why? Ah, if I only knew. When? Since I was here an hour ago. As to the door being locked, it is a very ordinary lock. Probably any other of the door keys in this passage would fit it. We stared at one another blankly. Poirot had walked over to the mantelpiece. He was outwardly calm, but I noticed his hands, which from long force of habit were mechanically straightening the spill vases on the mantelpiece, were shaking violently. See here, it was like this, he said at last. There was something in that case, some piece of evidence, slight in itself perhaps, but still enough of a clue to connect the murderer with the crime. It was vital to him that it should be destroyed before it was discovered and its significance appreciated. Therefore, he took the risk, the great risk, of coming in here. Finding the case locked, he was obliged to force it, thus betraying his presence. For him to take that risk, it must have been something of great importance. But what was it? "Ah!" cried Poirot, with a gesture of anger. "That, I do not know. A document of some kind, without doubt, possibly the scrap of paper Dorcas saw in her hand yesterday afternoon." And his anger burst forth freely. "Miserable animal that I am! I guessed nothing. I have behaved like an imbecile. I should never have left that case here. I should have carried it away with me. Ah, triple pig! And now it is gone. It is destroyed. But is it destroyed? Is there not yet a chance? We must leave no stone unturned." He rushed like a madman from the room, and I followed him as soon as I had sufficiently recovered my wits. But, by the time I had reached the top of the stairs, he was out of sight. Mary Cavendish was standing where the staircase branched, staring down into the hall in the direction in which he had disappeared. "What has happened to your extraordinary little friend, Mr. Hastings? He has just rushed past me like a mad bull." "He's rather upset about something," I remarked feebly. I really did not know how much Poirot would wish me to disclose. As I saw a faint smile gather on Mrs. Cavendish's expressive mouth, I endeavored to try and turn the conversation by saying, "They haven't met yet, have they?" "Who?" "Mr. Inglethorp and Miss Howard." She looked at me in rather a disconcerting manner. "Do you think it would be such a disaster if they did meet?" "Well, don't you?" I said, rather taken aback. "No." She was smiling in her quiet way. "I should like to see a good flare-up. It would clear the air. At present we are all thinking so much, and saying so little." "John doesn't think so," I remarked. "He's anxious to keep them apart." "Oh, John." Something in her tone fired me, and I blurted out, "Old John's an awfully good sort." She studied me curiously for a minute or two, and then said, to my great surprise, "You are loyal to your friend. I like you for that. Aren't you my friend too?" "I am a very bad friend." "Why do you say that?" "Because it is true. I am charming to my friends one day, and forget all about them the next." I don't know what impelled me, but I was nettled, and I said foolishly and not in the best of taste, "Yet you seem to be invariably charming to Dr. Bauerstein." Instantly I regretted my words. Her face stiffened. I had the impression of a steel curtain coming down and blotting out the real woman. Without a word, she turned and went swiftly up the stairs, whilst I stood like an idiot gaping after her. I was recalled to other matters by a frightful row going on below. I could hear Poirot shouting and expounding. I was vexed to think that my diplomacy had been in vain. The little man appeared to be taking the whole house into his confidence, a proceeding of which I, for one, doubted the wisdom. Once again I could not help regretting that my friend was so prone to lose his head in moments of excitement. I stepped briskly down the stairs. The sight of me calmed Poirot almost immediately. I drew him aside. "My dear fellow," I said, "is this wise? Surely you don't want the whole house to know of this occurrence? You are actually playing into the criminal's hands." "You think so, Hastings?" "I am sure of it." Well, my friend, I will be guided by you." "Good. Although, unfortunately, it is a little too late now." "Sure." He looked so crestfallen and abashed that I felt quite sorry, though I still thought my rebuke a just and wise one. "Well," he said at last, "let us go, mon ami. You have finished here." "For the moment, yes. You will walk back with me to the village." "Willingly." He picked up his little suitcase, and we went out through the open window in the drawing-room. Cynthia Murdoch was just coming in, and Poirot stood aside to let her pass. "Excuse me, mademoiselle, 1 minute." "Yes?" She turned inquiringly. "Did you ever make up Mrs. Inglethorpe's medicines?" A slight flush rose in her face, as she answered rather constrainedly, "No." "Only her powders?" The flush deepened as Cynthia replied, "Oh, yes, I did make up some sleeping powders for her once." "These?" Poirot produced the empty box which had contained powders. She nodded. Can you tell me what they were? Sulfonal? Veronal? No, they were bromide powders. Ah. Thank you, mademoiselle, good morning. As we walked briskly away from the house, I glanced at him more than once. I had often before noticed that, if anything excited him, his eyes turned green like a cat's. They were shining like emeralds now. My friend, he broke out at last, I have a little idea, a very strange and probably utterly impossible idea. And yet it fits in. I shrugged my shoulders. I privately thought that Poirot was rather too much given to these fantastic ideas. In this case, surely, the truth was only too plain and apparent. So that is the explanation of the blank label on the box, I remarked. Very simple, as you said. I really wonder that I did not think of it myself. Poirot did not appear to be listening to me. They have made one more discovery, La Basse, he observed, jerking his thumb over his shoulder in the direction of Styles. Mr. Wells told me as we were going upstairs. What was it? Locked up in the desk in the boudoir, they found a will of Mrs. Inglethorpe's, dated before her marriage, leaving her fortune to Alfred Inglethorpe. It must have been made just at the time they were engaged. It came quite as a surprise to Wells and to John Cavendish also. It was written on one of those printed will forms, and witnessed by two of the servants, not Dorcas. Did Mr. Inglethorpe know of it? He says not. One might take that with a grain of salt, I remarked skeptically. All these wills are very confusing. Tell me, how did those scribbled words on the envelope help you to discover that a will was made yesterday afternoon? Poirot smiled. Mon ami, have you ever, when writing a letter, been arrested by the fact that you did not know how to spell a certain word? Yes, often. I suppose everyone has. Exactly. And have you not, in such a case, tried the word once or twice on the edge of the blotting paper, or a spare scrap of paper, to see if it looked right? Well, that is what Mrs. Inglethorpe did. You will notice that the word possessed is spelt first with one S and subsequently with two correctly. To make sure, she had further tried it in a sentence, thus, I am possessed. Now, what did that tell me? It told me that Mrs. Inglethorpe had been writing the word possessed that afternoon, and, having the fragment of paper found in the grate fresh in my mind, the possibility of a will, a document almost certain to contain that word, occurred to me at once. This possibility was confirmed by a further circumstance. In the general confusion, the boudoir had not been swept that morning, and near the desk were several traces of brown mold and earth. The weather had been perfectly fine for some days, and no ordinary boots would have left such a heavy deposit. I strolled to the window, and saw at once that the begonia beds had been newly planted. The mold in the beds was exactly similar to that on the floor of the boudoir, and also I learnt from you that they had been planted yesterday afternoon. I was now sure that one, or possibly both of the gardeners, for there were two sets of footprints in the bed, had entered the boudoir, for if Mrs. Inglethorpe had merely wished to speak to them she would in all probability have stood at the window, and they would not have come into the room at all. I was now quite convinced that she had made a fresh will, and had called the two gardeners in to witness her signature. Events proved that I was right in my supposition. That was very ingenious, I could not help admitting. I must confess that the conclusions I drew from those few scribbled words were quite erroneous. He smiled. You gave too much rein to your imagination. Imagination is a good servant, and a bad master. The simplest explanation is always the most likely. Another point, how did you know that the key of the dispatch case had been lost? I did not know it. It was a guess that turned out to be correct. You observed that it had a piece of twisted wire through the handle. That suggested to me at once that it had possibly been wrenched off a flimsy keyring. Now, if it had been lost and recovered, Mrs. Inglethorpe would at once have replaced it on her bunch, but on her bunch I found what was obviously the duplicate key, very new and bright, which led me to the hypothesis that somebody else had inserted the original key in the lock of the dispatch case. Yes, I said, Alfred Inglethorpe, without doubt. Poirot looked at me curiously. You are very sure of his guilt? Well, naturally. Every fresh circumstance seems to establish it more clearly. On the contrary, said Poirot quietly, there are several points in his favor. Oh, come now. Yes. I see only one. And that? That he was not in the house last night. Bad shot. As you English say. You have chosen the one point that to my mind tells against him. How is that? Because if Mr. Inglethorp knew that his wife would be poisoned last night, he would certainly have arranged to be away from the house. His excuse was an obviously trumped-up one. That leaves us two possibilities: either he knew what was going to happen or he had a reason of his own for his absence. And that reason? I asked skeptically. Poirot shrugged his shoulders. How should I know? Discreditable, without doubt. This Mr. Inglethorp, I should say, is somewhat of a scoundrel, but that does not of necessity make him a murderer. I shook my head, unconvinced. We do not agree, eh? Said Poirot. Well, let us leave it. Time will show which of us is right. Now let us turn to other aspects of the case. What do you make of the fact that all the doors of the bedroom were bolted on the inside? Well, I considered. One must look at it logically. True. I should put it this way. The doors were bolted, our own eyes have told us that, yet the presence of the candle grease on the floor, and the destruction of the will, prove that during the night someone entered the room. You agree so far? Perfectly. Put with admirable clearness. Proceed. Well, I said, encouraged, as the person who entered did not do so by the window, nor by miraculous means, it follows that the door must have been opened from inside by Mrs. Inglethorp herself. That strengthens the conviction that the person in question was her husband. She would naturally open the door to her own husband. Poirot shook his head. Why should she? She had bolted the door leading into his room. A most unusual proceeding on her part. She had had a most violent quarrel with him that very afternoon. No, he was the last person she would admit. But you agree with me that the door must have been opened by Mrs. Inglethorp herself? There is another possibility. She may have forgotten to bolt the door into the passage when she went to bed, and have got up later, towards morning, and bolted it then. Poirot, is that seriously your opinion? No, I do not say it is so, but it might be. Now, to turn to another feature, what do you make of the scrap of conversation you overheard between Mrs. Cavendish and her mother-in-law? I had forgotten that, I said thoughtfully. That is as enigmatical as ever. It seems incredible that a woman like Mrs. Cavendish, proud and reticent to the last degree, should interfere so violently in what was certainly not her affair. Precisely. It was an astonishing thing for a woman of her breeding to do. It is certainly curious, I agreed. Still, it is unimportant, and need not be taken into account. A groan burst from Poirot. What have I always told you? Everything must be taken into account. If the fact will not fit the theory, let the theory go. Well, we shall see, I said, nettled. Yes, we shall see. We had reached Leastways Cottage, and Poirot ushered me upstairs to his own room. He offered me one of the tiny Russian cigarettes he himself occasionally smoked. I was amused to notice that he stowed away the used matches most carefully in a little china pot. My momentary annoyance vanished. Poirot had placed our two chairs in front of the open window which commanded a view of the village street. The fresh air blew in warm and pleasant. It was going to be a hot day. Suddenly my attention was arrested by a weedy-looking young man rushing down the street at a great pace. It was the expression on his face that was extraordinary, a curious mingling of terror and agitation. Look, Poirot, I said. He leant forward. Tien, he said. It is Mr. Mace, from the chemist's shop. He is coming here. The young man came to a halt before Leastways Cottage, and, after hesitating a moment, pounded vigorously at the door. A little minute, cried Poirot from the window. I come. Motioning to me to follow him, He ran swiftly down the stairs and opened the door. Mr. Mace began at once. "Oh, Mr. Poirot, I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but I heard that you'd just come back from the hall." "Yes, we have." The young man moistened his dry lips. His face was working curiously. "It's all over the village about old Mrs. Inglethorp dying so suddenly. They do say," he lowered his voice cautiously, "that it's poison." Poirot's face remained quite impassive. "Only the doctors can tell us that, Mr. Mace." "Yes, exactly." Of course the young man hesitated, and then his agitation was too much for him. He clutched Poirot by the arm, and sank his voice to a whisper. "Just tell me this, Mr. Poirot, it isn't strychnine, is it?" I hardly heard what Poirot replied. Something evidently of a non-committal nature. The young man departed, and as he closed the door Poirot's eyes met mine. "Yes," he said, nodding gravely. "He will have evidence to give at the inquest." We went slowly upstairs again. I was opening my lips, when Poirot stopped me with a gesture of his hand. Not now, mon ami. I have need of reflection. My mind is in some disorder which is not well." For about 10 minutes he sat in dead silence, perfectly still, except for several expressive motions of his eyebrows, and all the time his eyes grew steadily greener. At last he heaved a deep sigh. "It is well. The bad moment has passed. Now all is arranged and classified. One must never permit confusion. The case is not clear yet, no. For it is of the most complicated. It puzzles me. Me, Hercule Poirot. There are 2 facts of significance." "And what are they?" "The first is the state of the weather yesterday. That is very important." "But it was a glorious day." I interrupted. "Poirot, you're pulling my leg." "Not at all. The thermometer registered 80 degrees in the shade. Do not forget that, my friend. It is the key to the whole riddle." "And the second point?" I asked. "The important fact that Monsieur Inglethorp wears very peculiar clothes, has a black beard, and uses glasses." "Poirot, I cannot believe you are serious." "I am absolutely serious, my friend." "But this is childish." "No, it is very momentous." "And supposing the coroner's jury returns a verdict of willful murder against Alfred Inglethorp, what becomes of your theories, then?" "They would not be shaken because 12 stupid men had happened to make a mistake. But that will not occur. For one thing, a country jury is not anxious to take responsibility upon itself, and Mr. Inglethorp stands practically in the position of local squire. Also," he added placidly, "I should not allow it." "You would not allow it?" "No." I looked at the extraordinary little man, divided between annoyance and amusement. He was so tremendously sure of himself. As though he read my thoughts, he nodded gently. "Oh, yes, mon ami, I would do what I say." He got up and laid his hand on my shoulder. His physiognomy underwent a complete change. Tears came into his eyes. "In all this, you see, I think of that poor Mrs. Inglethorp who is dead. She was not extravagantly loved, no. But she was very good to us Belgians. I owe her a debt." I endeavored to interrupt, but Poirot swept on. "Let me tell you this, Hastings. She would never forgive me if I let Alfred Inglethorp, her husband, be arrested now, when a word from me could save him." Chapter 6: The Inquest. In the interval before the inquest, Poirot was unfailing in his activity. Twice he was closeted with Mr. Wells. He also took long walks into the country. I rather resented his not taking me into his confidence, the more so as I could not in the least guess what he was driving at. It occurred to me that he might have been making inquiries at Rix's farm, so, finding him out when I called at Leastways Cottage on Wednesday evening, I walked over there by the fields, hoping to meet him. But there was no sign of him, and I hesitated to go right up to the farm itself. As I walked away, I met an aged rustic, who leered at me cunningly. "You'm from the Hall, ain't you?" he asked. "Yes. I'm looking for a friend of mine whom I thought might have walked this way." "A little chap?" As waves his hands when he talks? One of them Belgies from the village. Yes, I said eagerly. He has been here, then? Oh, he's been here, right enough. Morian once too. Friend of yours, is he? Ah, you gentlemen from the hall, you'd a pretty lot. And he leered more jocosely than ever. Why, do the gentlemen from the hall come here often? I asked, as carelessly as I could. He winked at me knowingly. One does, mister. Naming no names, mind. And a very liberal gentleman too. Oh, thank you, sir, I'm sure. I walked on sharply. Evelyn Howard had been right then, and I experienced a sharp twinge of disgust, as I thought of Alfred Inglethorpe's liberality with another woman's money. Had that piquant gypsy face been at the bottom of the crime, or was it the baser mainspring of money? Probably a judicious mixture of both. On one point, Poirot seemed to have a curious obsession. He once or twice observed to me that he thought Dorcas must have made an error in fixing the time of the quarrel. He suggested to her repeatedly that it was 4:30, and not 4 o'clock when she had heard the voices. But Dorcas was unshaken. Quite an hour, or even more, had elapsed between the time when she had heard the voices and 5 o'clock, when she had taken tea to her mistress. The inquest was held on Friday at the Stylites Arms in the village. Poirot and I sat together, not being required to give evidence. The preliminaries were gone through. The jury viewed the body, and John Cavendish gave evidence of identification. Further questioned, he described his awakening in the early hours of the morning, and the circumstances of his mother's death. The medical evidence was next taken. There was a breathless hush, and every eye was fixed on the famous London specialist, who was known to be one of the greatest authorities of the day on the subject of toxicology. In a few brief words, he summed up the result of the post-mortem. Shorn of its medical phraseology and technicalities, it amounted to the fact that Mrs. Inglethorpe had met her death as the result of strychnine poisoning. Judging from the quantity recovered, she must have taken not less than 3/4 of a grain of strychnine, but probably 1 grain or slightly over. Is it possible that she could have swallowed the poison by accident? Asked the coroner. I should consider it very unlikely. Strychnine is not used for domestic purposes, as some poisons are, and there are restrictions placed on its sale. Does anything in your examination lead you to determine how the poison was administered? No. You arrived at Styles before Dr. Wilkins, I believe? That is so. The motor met me just outside the lodge gates, and I hurried there as fast as I could. Will you relate to us exactly what happened next? I entered Mrs. Inglethorpe's room. She was at that moment in a typical tetanic convulsion. She turned towards me, and gasped out, "Alfred, Alfred." Could the strychnine have been administered in Mrs. Inglethorpe's after-dinner coffee which was taken to her by her husband? Possibly, but strychnine is a fairly rapid drug in its action. The symptoms appear from 1 to 2 hours after it has been swallowed. It is retarded under certain conditions, none of which, however, appear to have been present in this case. I presume Mrs. Inglethorpe took the coffee after dinner about 8 o'clock, whereas the symptoms did not manifest themselves until the early hours of the morning, which, on the face of it, points to the drug having been taken much later in the evening. Mrs. Inglethorpe was in the habit of drinking a cup of cocoa in the middle of the night. Could the strychnine have been administered in that? No, I myself took a sample of the cocoa remaining in the saucepan and had it analyzed. There was no strychnine present. I heard Poirot chuckle softly beside me. How did you know? I whispered. Listen. I should say the doctor was continuing that I would have been considerably surprised at any other result. Why? Simply because strychnine has an unusually bitter taste. It can be detected in a solution of 1 in 70,000, and can only be disguised by some strongly flavored substance. Cocoa would be quite powerless to mask it. One of the jury wanted to know if the same objection applied to coffee. No. Coffee has a bitter taste of its own which would probably cover the taste of strychnine. Then you consider it more likely that the drug was administered in the coffee, but that for some unknown reason its action was delayed. Yes, but, the cup being completely smashed, there is no possibility of analyzing its contents. This concluded Dr. Bauerstein's evidence. Dr. Wilkins corroborated it on all points. Sounded as to the possibility of suicide, he repudiated it utterly. The deceased, he said, suffered from a weak heart, but otherwise enjoyed perfect health, and was of a cheerful and well-balanced disposition. She would be one of the last people to take her own life. Lawrence Cavendish was next called. His evidence was quite unimportant, being a mere repetition of that of his brother. Just as he was about to step down, he paused, and said rather hesitatingly, "I should like to make a suggestion if I may?" He glanced deprecatingly at the coroner, who replied briskly, "Certainly, Mr. Cavendish, we are here to arrive at the truth of this matter, and welcome anything that may lead to further elucidation." "It is just an idea of mine," explained Lawrence. "Of course I may be quite wrong, but it still seems to me that my mother's death might be accounted for by natural means." "How do you make that out, Mr. Cavendish?" "My mother, at the time of her death, and for some time before it, was taking a tonic containing strychnine." "Ah," said the coroner. The jury looked up, interested. "I believe," continued Lawrence, "that there have been cases where the cumulative effect of a drug, administered for some time, has ended by causing death. Also, is it not possible that she may have taken an overdose of her medicine by accident? This is the first we have heard of the deceased taking strychnine at the time of her death. We are much obliged to you, Mr. Cavendish." Dr. Wilkins was recalled and ridiculed the idea. "What Mr. Cavendish suggests is quite impossible. Any doctor would tell you the same. Strychnine is, in a certain sense, a cumulative poison, but it would be quite impossible for it to result in sudden death in this way. There would have to be a long period of chronic symptoms which would at once have attracted my attention. The whole thing is absurd." "And the second suggestion? That Mrs. Inglethorp may have inadvertently taken an overdose? 3, or even 4 doses, would not have resulted in death. Mrs. Inglethorp always had an extra large amount of medicine made up at a time, as she dealt with Coots, the cash chemists in Tadminster. She would have had to take very nearly the whole bottle to account for the amount of strychnine found at the post-mortem. Then you consider that we may dismiss the tonic as not being in any way instrumental in causing her death?" "Certainly. The supposition is ridiculous." The same juryman who had interrupted before here suggested that the chemist who made up the medicine might have committed an error. "That, of course, is always possible," replied the doctor. But Dorcas, who was the next witness called, dispelled even that possibility. The medicine had not been newly made up. On the contrary, Mrs. Inglethorp had taken the last dose on the day of her death. So the question of the tonic was finally abandoned, and the coroner proceeded with his task. Having elicited from Dorcas how she had been awakened by the violent ringing of her mistress's bell, and had subsequently roused the household, he passed to the subject of the quarrel on the preceding afternoon. Dorcas's evidence on this point was substantially what Poirot and I had already heard, so I will not repeat it here. The next witness was Mary Cavendish. She stood very upright, and spoke in a low, clear, and perfectly composed voice. In answer to the coroner's question, she told how, her alarm clock having aroused her at 4:30 as usual, she was dressing, when she was startled by the sound of something heavy falling. "That would have been the table by the bed," commented the coroner. "I opened my door," continued Mary, "and listened. In a few minutes a bell rang violently. Dorcas came running down and woke my husband, and we all went to my mother-in-law's room, but it was locked." The coroner interrupted her. "I really do not think we need trouble you further on that point. We know all that can be known of the subsequent happenings. But I should be obliged if you would tell us all you overheard of the quarrel the day before." "I?" There was a faint insolence in her voice. She raised her hand and adjusted the ruffle of lace at her neck, turning her head a little as she did so. And quite spontaneously the thought flashed across my mind, she is gaining time. "Yes. I understand," continued the coroner deliberately, that you were sitting reading on the bench just outside the long window of the boudoir. That is so, is it not? This was news to me, and glancing sideways at Poirot, I fancied that it was news to him as well. There was the faintest pause, the mere hesitation of a moment, before she answered. Yes, that is so. And the boudoir window was open, was it not? Surely her face grew a little paler as she answered. Yes, then you cannot have failed to hear the voices inside, especially as they were raised in anger. In fact, they would be more audible where you were then in the hall. Possibly. Will you repeat to us what you overheard of the quarrel? I really do not remember hearing anything. Do you mean to say you did not hear voices? Oh, yes, I heard the voices, but I did not hear what they said. A faint spot of color came into her cheek. I am not in the habit of listening to private conversations. The coroner persisted. And you remember nothing at all? Nothing, Mrs. Cavendish? Not one stray word or phrase to make you realize that it was a private conversation? She paused, and seemed to reflect, still outwardly as calm as ever. Yes, I remember. Mrs. Inglethorp said something, I do not remember exactly what, about causing scandal between husband and wife. Ah. The coroner leant back satisfied. That corresponds with what Dorcas heard. But excuse me, Mrs. Cavendish, although you realized it was a private conversation, you did not move away. You remained where you were? I caught the momentary gleam of her tawny eyes as she raised them. I felt certain that at that moment she would willingly have torn the little lawyer, with his insinuations, into pieces, but she replied quietly enough. No. I was very comfortable where I was. I fixed my mind on my book. And that is all you can tell us? That is all. The examination was over, though I doubted if the coroner was entirely satisfied with it. I think he suspected that Mary Cavendish could tell more if she chose. Amy Hill, shop assistant, was next called, and deposed to having sold a wool form on the afternoon of the 17th to William Earl, under gardener at Styles. William Earl and Manning succeeded her, and testified to witnessing a document. Manning fixed the time at about 4:30, William was of the opinion that it was rather earlier. Cynthia Murdoch came next. She had, however, little to tell. She had known nothing of the tragedy, until awakened by Mrs. Cavendish. You did not hear the table fall? No. I was fast asleep. The coroner smiled. A good conscience makes a sound sleeper, he observed. Thank you, Miss Murdoch, that is all. Miss Howard. Miss Howard produced the letter written to her by Mrs. Inglethorp on the evening of the 17th. Poirot and I had, of course, already seen it. It added nothing to our knowledge of the tragedy. The following is a facsimile. Styles Court, Essex. Handwritten note. July 17th. My dear Evelyn. Can we not bury the ashes? I have found it hard to forgive the things you said against my dear husband, but I am an old woman and very fond of you. Yours affectionately, Emily Inglethorp. It was handed to the jury, who scrutinized it attentively. I fear it does not help us much, said the coroner, with a sigh. There is no mention of any of the events of that afternoon. Plain as a pikestaff to me, said Miss Howard shortly. It shows clearly enough that my poor old friend had just found out she'd been made a fool of. It says nothing of the kind in the letter, the coroner pointed out. No, because Emily never could bear to put herself in the wrong. But I know her. She wanted me back. But she wasn't going to own that I'd been right. She went roundabout. Most people do. Don't believe in it myself. Mr. Wells smiled faintly. So, I noticed, did several of the jury. Miss Howard was obviously quite a public character. Anyway, all this tomfoolery is a great waste of time, continued the lady, glancing up and down the jury disparagingly. Talk, talk, talk. When all the time we know perfectly well. The coroner interrupted her in an agony of apprehension. Thank you, Miss Howard, that is all. I fancy he breathed a sigh of relief when she complied. Then came the sensation of the day. The coroner called Albert Mace, chemist's assistant. It was our agitated young man of the pale face. In answer to the coroner's questions, he explained that he was a qualified pharmacist, but had only recently come to this particular shop, as the assistant formerly there had just been called up for the army. These preliminaries completed, the coroner proceeded to business. Mr. Mace, have you lately sold strychnine to any unauthorized person? Yes, sir. When was this? Last Monday night. Monday? Not Tuesday. No, sir, Monday, the 16th. Will you tell us to whom you sold it? You could have heard a pin drop. Yes, sir. It was to Mr. Inglethorp. Every eye turned simultaneously to where Alfred Inglethorp was sitting, impassive and wooden. He started slightly, as the damning words fell from the young man's lips. I half thought he was going to rise from his chair, but he remained seated, although a remarkably well-acted expression of astonishment rose on his face. You are sure of what you say? Asked the coroner sternly. Quite sure, sir. Are you in the habit of selling strychnine indiscriminately over the counter? The wretched young man wilted visibly under the coroner's frown. Oh, no, sir, of course not. But, seeing it was Mr. Inglethorp of the Hall, I thought there was no harm in it. He said it was to poison a dog. Inwardly I sympathized. It was only human nature to endeavor to please the Hall, especially when it might result in custom being transferred from Coots to the local establishment. Is it not customary for anyone purchasing poison to sign a book? Yes, sir, Mr. Inglethorp did so. Have you got the book here? Yes, sir. It was produced, and, with a few words of stern censure, the coroner dismissed the wretched Mr. Mace. Then, amidst a breathless silence, Alfred Inglethorp was called. Did he realize, I wondered, how closely the halter was being drawn around his neck? The coroner went straight to the point. On Monday evening last, did you purchase strychnine for the purpose of poisoning a dog? Inglethorp replied with perfect calmness. No, I did not. There is no dog at Styles, except an outdoor sheepdog, which is in perfect health. You deny absolutely having purchased strychnine from Albert Mace on Monday last? I do. Do you also deny this? The coroner handed him the register in which his signature was inscribed. Certainly I do. The handwriting is quite different from mine. I will show you. He took an old envelope out of his pocket, and wrote his name on it, handing it to the jury. It was certainly utterly dissimilar. Then what is your explanation of Mr. Mace's statement? Alfred Inglethorp replied imperturbably. Mr. Mace must have been mistaken. The coroner hesitated for a moment, and then said, Mr. Inglethorp, as a mere matter of form, would you mind telling us where you were on the evening of Monday, July 16th? Really, I cannot remember. That is absurd, Mr. Inglethorp, said the coroner sharply. Think again. Inglethorp shook his head. I cannot tell you. I have an idea that I was out walking. In what direction? I really can't remember. The coroner's face grew graver. Were you in company with anyone? No. Did you meet anyone on your walk? No. That is a pity, said the coroner dryly. I am to take it then that you decline to say where you were at the time that Mr. Mace positively recognized you as entering the shop to purchase strychnine? If you like to take it that way, yes. Be careful, Mr. Inglethorp. Poirot was fidgeting nervously. Sacré, he murmured. Does this imbecile of a man want to be arrested? Inglethorp was indeed creating a bad impression. His futile denials would not have convinced a child. The coroner, however, passed briskly to the next point, and Poirot drew a deep breath of relief. You had a discussion with your wife on Tuesday afternoon? Pardon me, interrupted Alfred Inglethorp, you have been misinformed. I had no quarrel with my dear wife, the whole story is absolutely untrue. I was absent from the house the entire afternoon. Have you anyone who can testify to that? You have my word, said Inglethorp haughtily. The coroner did not trouble to reply. There are 2 witnesses who will swear to having heard your disagreement with Mrs. Inglethorp. Those witnesses were mistaken. I was puzzled. The man spoke with such quiet assurance that I was staggered. I looked at Poirot. There was an expression of exultation on his face which I could not understand. Was he at last convinced of Alfred Inglethorpe's guilt? Mr. Inglethorp, said the coroner, you have heard your wife's dying words repeated here. Can you explain them in any way? Certainly I can. You can? It seems to me very simple. The room was dimly lighted. Dr. Bauerstein is much of my height and build, and, like me, wears a beard. In the dim light, and suffering as she was, my poor wife mistook him for me. Ah! Murmured Poirot to himself. But it is an idea, that. You think it is true? I whispered. I do not say that. But it is truly an ingenious supposition. You read my wife's last words as an accusation Inglethorpe was continuing. They were, on the contrary, an appeal to me. The coroner reflected a moment, then he said, I believe, Mr. Inglethorpe, that you yourself poured out the coffee, and took it to your wife that evening? I poured it out, yes. But I did not take it to her. I meant to do so, but I was told that a friend was at the hall door, so I laid down the coffee on the hall table. When I came through the hall again a few minutes later, it was gone. This statement might, or might not, be true, but it did not seem to me to improve matters much for Inglethorpe. In any case, he had had ample time to introduce the poison. At that point, Poirot nudged me gently, indicating 2 men who were sitting together near the door. One was a little, sharp, dark, ferret-faced man, the other was tall and fair. I questioned Poirot mutely. He put his lips to my ear. Do you know who that little man is? I shook my head. That is Detective Inspector James Japp of Scotland Yard, Jimmy Japp. The other man is from Scotland Yard too. Things are moving quickly, my friend. I stared at the 2 men intently. There was certainly nothing of the policeman about them. I should never have suspected them of being official personages. I was still staring, when I was startled and recalled by the verdict being given. Willful murder against some person or persons unknown. Chapter 7 Poirot pays his debts. As we came out of the Stylites Arms, Poirot drew me aside by a gentle pressure of the arm. I understood his object. He was waiting for the Scotland Yard men. In a few moments, they emerged, and Poirot at once stepped forward, and accosted the shorter of the 2. I fear you do not remember me, Inspector Japp. Why, if it isn't Mr. Poirot, cried the inspector. He turned to the other man. You've heard me speak of Mr. Poirot? It was in 1904 he and I worked together, the Abercrombie forgery case, you remember, he was run down in Brussels. Ah, those were great days, Monsieur. Then, do you remember Baron Altara? There was a pretty rogue for you. He eluded the clutches of half the police in Europe. But we nailed him in Antwerp, thanks to Mr. Poirot here. As these friendly reminiscences were being indulged in, I drew nearer, and was introduced to Detective Inspector Japp, who, in his turn, introduced us both to his companion, Superintendent Summerhay. I need hardly ask what you are doing here, gentlemen, remarked Poirot. Japp closed one eye knowingly. No, indeed. Pretty clear case, I should say. But Poirot answered gravely. There I differ from you. Oh, come, said Summerhay, opening his lips for the first time. Surely the whole thing is clear as daylight. The man's caught red-handed. How he could be such a fool beats me. But Japp was looking attentively at Poirot. Hold your fire, Summerhay, he remarked jocularly. Me and Monsieur here have met before, and there's no man's judgment I'd sooner take than his. If I'm not greatly mistaken, he's got something up his sleeve. Isn't that so, Monsieur? Poirot smiled. I have drawn certain conclusions, yes. Summerhay was still looking rather skeptical, but Japp continued his scrutiny of Poirot. "It's this way," he said. "So far, we've only seen the case from the outside. That's where the Yard's at a disadvantage in a case of this kind, where the murder's only out, so to speak, after the inquest. A lot depends on being on the spot first thing, and that's where Mr. Poirot's had the start of us. We shouldn't have been here as soon as this even, if it hadn't been for the fact that there was a smart doctor on the spot, who gave us the tip through the coroner. But you've been on the spot from the first, and you may have picked up some little hints. From the evidence at the inquest, Mr. Inglethorp murdered his wife as sure as I stand here, and if anyone but you hinted the contrary, I'd laugh in his face. I must say I was surprised the jury didn't bring it in willful murder against him right off. I think they would have, if it hadn't been for the coroner. He seemed to be holding them back. Perhaps, though, you have a warrant for his arrest in your pocket now," suggested Poirot. A kind of wooden shutter of officialdom came down from Japp's expressive countenance. "Perhaps I have, and perhaps I haven't," he remarked dryly. Poirot looked at him thoughtfully. "I am very anxious, messieurs, that he should not be arrested." "I dare say," observed Summerhay sarcastically. Japp was regarding Poirot with comical perplexity. "Can't you go a little further, Mr. Poirot? A wink's as good as a nod from you. You've been on the spot and the Yard doesn't want to make any mistakes, you know." Poirot nodded gravely. "That is exactly what I thought. Well, I will tell you this. Use your warrant, arrest Mr. Inglethorp. But it will bring you no kudos, the case against him will be dismissed at once. Comme ça." And he snapped his fingers expressively. Japp's face grew grave, though Summerhay gave an incredulous snort. As for me, I was literally dumb with astonishment. I could only conclude that Poirot was mad. Japp had taken out a handkerchief, and was gently dabbing his brow. "I daren't do it, Mr. Poirot. I'd take your word, but there's others over me who'll be asking what the devil I mean by it. Can't you give me a little more to go on?" Poirot reflected a moment. "It can be done," he said at last. "I admit I do not wish it. It forces my hand. I would have preferred to work in the dark just for the present, but what you say is very just. The word of a Belgian policeman, whose day is past, is not enough. And Alfred Inglethorp must not be arrested. That I have sworn, as my friend Hastings here knows. See, then, my good Japp, you go at once to Styles." "Well, in about half an hour. We're seeing the coroner and the doctor first." "Good. Call for me in passing, the last house in the village. I will go with you. At Styles, Mr. Inglethorp will give you, or if he refuses, as is probable, I will give you such proofs that shall satisfy you that the case against him could not possibly be sustained. Is that a bargain?" "That's a bargain," said Japp heartily. "And, on behalf of the Yard, I'm much obliged to you, though I'm bound to confess I can't at present see the faintest possible loophole in the evidence, but you always were a marvel. So long, then, Monsieur." The two detectives strode away, Summerhay with an incredulous grin on his face. "Well, my friend," cried Poirot, before I could get in a word, "what do you think? Mon Dieu! I had some warm moments in that court. I did not figure to myself that the man would be so pig-headed as to refuse to say anything at all. Decidedly, it was the policy of an imbecile." "There are other explanations besides that of imbecility," I remarked, "for, if the case against him is true, how could he defend himself except by silence?" "Why, in 1,000 ingenious ways," cried Poirot. Say that it is I who have committed this murder. I can think of 7 most plausible stories. Far more convincing than Mr. Inglethorpe's stony denials." I could not help laughing. "My dear Poirot, I am sure you are capable of thinking of 70. But, seriously, in spite of what I heard you say to the detectives, you surely cannot still believe in the possibility of Alfred Inglethorpe's innocence? Why not now as much as before? Nothing has changed. But the evidence is so conclusive." "Yes, too conclusive." We turned in at the gate of Leastways Cottage, and proceeded up the now familiar stairs. Yes, too conclusive," continued Poirot, almost to himself. Real evidence is usually vague and unsatisfactory. It has to be examined, sifted. But here the whole thing is cut and dried. No, my friend, this evidence has been very cleverly manufactured, so cleverly that it has defeated its own ends. How do you make that out? Because, so long as the evidence against him was vague and intangible, it was very hard to disprove. But, in his anxiety, the criminal has drawn the net so closely that one cut will set Inglethorp free. I was silent. And in a minute or two, Poirot continued. Let us look at the matter like this. Here is a man, let us say, who sets out to poison his wife. He has lived by his wits, as the saying goes. Presumably, therefore, he has some wits. He is not altogether a fool. Well, how does he set about it? He goes boldly to the village chemist's and purchases strychnine under his own name, with a trumped-up story about a dog which is bound to be proved absurd. He does not employ the poison that night. No, he waits until he has had a violent quarrel with her, of which the whole household is cognizant, and which naturally directs their suspicions upon him. He prepares no defense, no shadow of an alibi, yet he knows the chemist's assistant must necessarily come forward with the facts. Ah! Do not ask me to believe that any man could be so idiotic. Only a lunatic, who wished to commit suicide by causing himself to be hanged, would act so. Still I do not see, I began. Neither do I see. I tell you, mon ami, it puzzles me. Me, Hercule Poirot. But if you believe him innocent, how do you explain his buying the strychnine? Very simply. He did not buy it. But Mace recognized him. I beg your pardon, he saw a man with a black beard like Mr. Inglethorpe's, and wearing glasses like Mr. Inglethorpe, and dressed in Mr. Inglethorpe's rather noticeable clothes. He could not recognize a man whom he had probably only seen in the distance, since, you remember, he himself had only been in the village a fortnight, and Mrs. Inglethorpe dealt principally with coots in Tadminster. Then you think. Mon ami, do you remember the 2 points I laid stress upon? Leave the first one for the moment. What was the second? The important fact that Alfred Inglethorpe wears peculiar clothes, has a black beard, and uses glasses, I quoted. Exactly. Now suppose anyone wished to pass himself off as John or Lawrence Cavendish. Would it be easy? No, I said thoughtfully. Of course an actor. But Poirot cut me short ruthlessly. And why would it not be easy? I will tell you, my friend, because they are both clean-shaven men. To make up successfully as one of these two in broad daylight, it would need an actor of genius, and a certain initial facial resemblance. But in the case of Alfred Inglethorpe, all that is changed. His clothes, his beard, the glasses which hide his eyes, those are the salient points about his personal appearance. Now, what is the first instinct of the criminal? To divert suspicion from himself, is it not so? And how can he best do that? By throwing it on someone else. In this instance, there was a man ready to his hand. Everybody was predisposed to believe in Mr. Inglethorpe's guilt. It was a foregone conclusion that he would be suspected, but, to make it a sure thing, there must be tangible proof such as the actual buying of the poison, and that, with a man of the peculiar appearance of Mr. Inglethorpe, was not difficult. Remember, this young Mace had never actually spoken to Mr. Inglethorpe. How should he doubt that the man in his clothes, with his beard and his glasses, was not Alfred Inglethorpe? It may be so, I said, fascinated by Poirot's eloquence. But, if that was the case, why does he not say where he was at 6 o'clock on Monday evening? Ah, why indeed? Said Poirot, calming down. If he were arrested, he probably would speak, but I do not want it to come to that. I must make him see the gravity of his position. There is, of course, something discreditable behind his silence. If he did not murder his wife, he is, nevertheless, a scoundrel, and has something of his own to conceal, quite apart from the murder. What can it be? I mused, won over to Poirot's views for the moment, although still retaining a faint conviction that the obvious deduction was the correct one. Can you not guess? Asked Poirot, smiling. No, Can you? Oh, yes, I had a little idea some time ago and it has turned out to be correct. You never told me, I said reproachfully. Poirot spread out his hands apologetically. Pardon me, mon ami, you were not precisely sympathique. He turned to me earnestly. Tell me you see now that he must not be arrested? Perhaps, I said doubtfully, for I was really quite indifferent to the fate of Alfred Inglethorp, and thought that a good fright would do him no harm. Poirot, who was watching me intently, gave a sigh. Come, my friend, he said, changing the subject, apart from Mr. Inglethorp, how did the evidence at the inquest strike you? Oh, pretty much what I expected. Did nothing strike you as peculiar about it? My thoughts flew to Mary Cavendish, and I hedged. In what way? Well, Mr. Lawrence Cavendish's evidence, for instance. I was relieved. Oh, Lawrence. No, I don't think so. He's always a nervous chap. His suggestion that his mother might have been poisoned accidentally by means of the tonic she was taking, that did not strike you as strange, Hein? No, I can't say it did. The doctors ridiculed it, of course. But it was quite a natural suggestion for a layman to make. But Monsieur Lawrence is not a layman. You told me yourself that he had started by studying medicine, and that he had taken his degree. Yes, that's true. I never thought of that. I was rather startled. It is odd. Poirot nodded. From the first, his behavior has been peculiar. Of all the household, he alone would be likely to recognize the symptoms of strychnine poisoning, and yet we find him the only member of the family to uphold strenuously the theory of death from natural causes. If it had been Monsieur John, I could have understood it. He has no technical knowledge, and is by nature unimaginative. But Monsieur Lawrence, no. And now, today, he puts forward a suggestion that he himself must have known was ridiculous. There is food for thought in this, mon ami. It's very confusing, I agreed. Then there is Mrs. Cavendish, continued Poirot. That's another who is not telling all she knows. What do you make of her attitude? I don't know what to make of it. It seems inconceivable that she should be shielding Alfred Inglethorp. Yet that is what it looks like. Poirot nodded reflectively. Yes, it is queer. One thing is certain, she overheard a good deal more of that private conversation than she was willing to admit. And yet she is the last person one would accuse of stooping to eavesdrop. Exactly. One thing her evidence has shown me. I made a mistake. Dorcas was quite right. The quarrel did take place earlier in the afternoon, about 4 o'clock, as she said. I looked at him curiously. I had never understood his insistence on that point. Yes, a good deal that was peculiar came out today, continued Poirot. Dr. Bauerstein, now, what was he doing up and dressed at that hour in the morning? It is astonishing to me that no one commented on the fact. He has insomnia, I believe, I said doubtfully. Which is a very good, or a very bad explanation, remarked Poirot. It covers everything, and explains nothing. I shall keep my eye on our clever Dr. Bauerstein. Any more faults to find with the evidence? I inquired satirically. Mon ami, replied Poirot gravely, when you find that people are not telling you the truth, look out. Now, unless I am much mistaken, at the inquest today only one, at most, 2 persons were speaking the truth without reservation or subterfuge. Oh, come now, Poirot. I won't cite Lawrence, or Mrs. Cavendish. But there's John and Miss Howard, surely they were speaking the truth. Both of them, my friend? One, I grant you, but both. His words gave me an unpleasant shock. Miss Howard's evidence, unimportant as it was, had been given in such a downright straightforward manner that it had never occurred to me to doubt her sincerity. Still, I had a great respect for Poirot's sagacity except on the occasions when he was what I described to myself as foolishly pig-headed. Do you really think so? I asked. Miss Howard had always seemed to me so essentially honest, almost uncomfortably so. Poirot gave me a curious look, which I could not quite fathom. He seemed to speak, and then checked himself. Miss Murdoch too, I continued, there's nothing untruthful about her. No. But it was strange that she never heard a sound, sleeping next door, whereas Mrs. Cavendish, in the other wing of the building, distinctly heard the table fall. Well, she's young. And she sleeps soundly. Ah, yes, indeed. She must be a famous sleeper, that one. I did not quite like the tone of his voice, but at that moment a smart knock reached our ears, and looking out of the window we perceived the two detectives waiting for us below. Poirot seized his hat, gave a ferocious twist to his moustache, and, carefully brushing an imaginary speck of dust from his sleeve, motioned me to precede him down the stairs. There we joined the detectives and set out for Styles. I think the appearance of the two Scotland Yard men was rather a shock, especially to John, though of course after the verdict, he had realized that it was only a matter of time. Still, the presence of the detectives brought the truth home to him more than anything else could have done. Poirot had conferred with Japp in a low tone on the way up, and it was the latter functionary who requested that the household, with the exception of the servants, should be assembled together in the drawing-room. I realized the significance of this. It was up to Poirot to make his boast good. Personally, I was not sanguine. Poirot might have excellent reasons for his belief in Inglethorp's innocence, but a man of the type of Summerhay would require tangible proofs, and these I doubted if Poirot could supply. Before very long we had all trooped into the drawing-room, the door of which Japp closed. Poirot politely set chairs for everyone. The Scotland Yard men were the cynosure of all eyes. I think that for the first time we realized that the thing was not a bad dream, but a tangible reality. We had read of such things, now we ourselves were actors in the drama. Tomorrow the daily papers, all over England, would blazon out the news in staring headlines. Mysterious tragedy in Essex. Wealthy lady poisoned. There would be pictures of Styles, snapshots of the family leaving the inquest. The village photographer had not been idle. All the things that one had read 100 times, things that happened to other people, not to oneself. And now, in this house, a murder had been committed. In front of us were the detectives in charge of the case. The well-known glib phraseology passed rapidly through my mind in the interval before Poirot opened the proceedings. I think everyone was a little surprised that it should be he and not one of the official detectives who took the initiative. Mesdames and messieurs, said Poirot, bowing as though he were a celebrity about to deliver a lecture, I have asked you to come here all together, for a certain object. That object, it concerns Mr. Alfred Inglethorp. Inglethorp was sitting a little by himself, I think, unconsciously. Everyone had drawn his chair slightly away from him, and he gave a faint start as Poirot pronounced his name. Mr. Inglethorp, said Poirot, addressing him directly, a very dark shadow is resting on this house, the shadow of murder. Inglethorp shook his head sadly. My poor wife, he murmured. Poor Emily. It is terrible. I do not think, monsieur, said Poirot pointedly, that you quite realize how terrible it may be for you. And as Inglethorp did not appear to understand, he added, Mr. Inglethorp, you are standing in very grave danger. The two detectives fidgeted. I saw the official caution anything you say will be used in evidence against you, actually hovering on Summerhay's lips. Poirot went on. Do you understand now, monsieur? No. What do you mean? I mean, said Poirot deliberately, that you are suspected of poisoning your wife. A little gasp ran round the circle at this plain speaking. Good heavens! Cried Inglethorp, starting up. What a monstrous idea! I poison my dearest Emily. I do not think Poirot watched him narrowly that you quite realize the unfavorable nature of your evidence at the inquest. Mr. Inglethorp, knowing what I have now told you, do you still refuse to say where you were at 6 o'clock on Monday afternoon? With a groan, Alfred Inglethorp sank down again and buried his face in his hands. Poirot approached and stood over him. Speak! He cried menacingly. With an effort, Inglethorp raised his face from his hands, then, slowly and deliberately, he shook his head. You will not speak? No. I do not believe that anyone could be so monstrous as to accuse me of what you say. Poirot nodded thoughtfully, like a man whose mind is made up. "Soit," he said. "Then I must speak for you." Alfred Inglethorp sprang up again. "You? How can you speak? You do not know," he broke off abruptly. Poirot turned to face us. "Mesdames and messieurs, I speak. Listen. I, Hercule Poirot, affirm that the man who entered the chemist's shop and purchased strychnine at 6 o'clock on Monday last was not Mr. Inglethorp, for at 6 o'clock on that day Mr. Inglethorp was escorting Mrs. Rikes back to her home from a neighboring farm. I can produce no less than 5 witnesses to swear to having seen them together, either at 6 or just after, and, as you may know, the Abbey Farm, Mrs. Rikes's home, is at least 2.5 miles distant from the village. There is absolutely no question as to the alibi." Chapter 8: Fresh Suspicions. There was a moment's stupefied silence. Jap, who was the least surprised of any of us, was the first to speak. "My word," he cried, "you're the goods. And no mistake, Mr. Poirot. These witnesses of yours are all right, I suppose?" "Voilà. I have prepared a list of them, names and addresses. You must see them, of course. But you will find it all right." "I'm sure of that." Jap lowered his voice. "I'm much obliged to you. A pretty mare's nest arresting him would have been." He turned to Inglethorp. "But, if you'll excuse me, sir, why couldn't you say all this at the inquest?" "I will tell you why," interrupted Poirot. "There was a certain rumor." "A most malicious and utterly untrue one," interrupted Alfred Inglethorp in an agitated voice. "And Mr. Inglethorp was anxious to have no scandal revived just at present. Am I right?" "Quite right." Inglethorp nodded. "With my poor Emily not yet buried, can you wonder I was anxious that no more lying rumors should be started?" "Between you and me, sir," remarked Jap, "I'd sooner have any amount of rumors than be arrested for murder. And I venture to think your poor lady would have felt the same. And, if it hadn't been for Mr. Poirot here, arrested you would have been, as sure as eggs is eggs." "I was foolish, no doubt," murmured Inglethorp. "But you do not know, Inspector, how I have been persecuted and maligned." And he shot a baleful glance at Evelyn Howard. "Now, sir," said Jap, turning briskly to John, "I should like to see the lady's bedroom, please, and after that I'll have a little chat with the servants. Don't you bother about anything. Mr. Poirot, here, will show me the way." As they all went out of the room, Poirot turned and made me a sign to follow him upstairs. There he caught me by the arm, and drew me aside. "Quick, go to the other wing. Stand there just this side of the baize door. Do not move till I come." Then, turning rapidly, he rejoined the 2 detectives. I followed his instructions, taking up my position by the baize door, and wondering what on earth lay behind the request. Why was I to stand in this particular spot on guard? I looked thoughtfully down the corridor in front of me. An idea struck me. With the exception of Cynthia Murdoch's, everyone's room was in this left wing. Had that anything to do with it? Was I to report who came or went? I stood faithfully at my post. The minutes passed. Nobody came. Nothing happened. It must have been quite 20 minutes before Poirot rejoined me. "You have not stirred?" "No, I've stuck here like a rock. Nothing's happened." "Ah." Was he pleased, or disappointed? "You've seen nothing at all?" "No." "But you have probably heard something? A big bump, eh, mon ami?" "No." "Is it possible? Ah, but I am vexed with myself. I am not usually clumsy." I made but a slight gesture. I know Poirot's gestures with the left hand, and overwent the table by the bed. He looked so childishly vexed and crestfallen that I hastened to console him. "Never mind, old chap. What does it matter? Your triumph downstairs excited you. I can tell you, that was a surprise to us all. There must be more in this affair of Inglethorpe's with Mrs. Rikes than we thought, to make him hold his tongue so persistently. What are you going to do now? Where are the Scotland Yard fellows?" "Gone down to interview the servants. I showed them all our exhibits. I am disappointed in Jap. He has no method. Hello, I said, looking out of the window. Here's Dr. Bauerstein. I believe you're right about that man, Poirot. I don't like him. He is clever, observed Poirot meditatively. Oh, clever as the devil. I must say I was overjoyed to see him in the plight he was in on Tuesday. You never saw such a spectacle. And I described the doctor's adventure. He looked a regular scarecrow, plastered with mud from head to foot. You saw him, then? Yes. Of course, he didn't want to come in. It was just after dinner, but Mr. Inglethorp insisted. What? Poirot caught me violently by the shoulders. Was Dr. Bauerstein here on Tuesday evening? Here? And you never told me. Why did you not tell me? Why? Why? He appeared to be in an absolute frenzy. My dear Poirot, I expostulated, I never thought it would interest you. I didn't know it was of any importance. Importance? It is of the first importance. So Dr. Bauerstein was here on Tuesday night, the night of the murder. Hastings, do you not see? That alters everything, everything. I had never seen him so upset. Loosening his hold of me, he mechanically straightened a pair of candlesticks, still murmuring to himself, yes, that alters everything, everything. Suddenly he seemed to come to a decision. Allons, he said. We must act at once. Where is Mr. Cavendish? John was in the smoking room. Poirot went straight to him. Mr. Cavendish, I have some important business in Tadminster. A new clue. May I take your motor? Why, of course. Do you mean at once? If you please. John rang the bell, and ordered round the car. In another 10 minutes, we were racing down the park and along the high road to Tadminster. Now, Poirot, I remarked resignedly, perhaps you will tell me what all this is about? Well, mon ami, a good deal you can guess for yourself. Of course you realize that, now Mr. Inglethorp is out of it, the whole position is greatly changed. We are face to face with an entirely new problem. We know now that there is one person who did not buy the poison. We have cleared away the manufactured clues. Now for the real ones. I have ascertained that anyone in the household, with the exception of Mrs. Cavendish, who was playing tennis with you, could have personated Mr. Inglethorp on Monday evening. In the same way, we have his statement that he put the coffee down in the hall. No one took much notice of that at the inquest, but now it has a very different significance. We must find out who did take that coffee to Mrs. Inglethorp eventually, or who passed through the hall whilst it was standing there. From your account, there are only 2 people whom we can positively say did not go near the coffee, Mrs. Cavendish, and Mademoiselle Cynthia. Yes, that is so. I felt an inexpressible lightening of the heart. Mary Cavendish could certainly not rest under suspicion. In clearing Alfred Inglethorp, continued Poirot, I have been obliged to show my hand sooner than I intended. As long as I might be thought to be pursuing him, the criminal would be off his guard. Now, he will be doubly careful. Yes, doubly careful. He turned to me abruptly. Tell me, Hastings, you yourself, have you no suspicions of anybody? I hesitated. To tell the truth, an idea, wild and extravagant in itself, had once or twice that morning flashed through my brain. I had rejected it as absurd, nevertheless it persisted. You couldn't call it a suspicion, I murmured. It's so utterly foolish. Come now, urged Poirot encouragingly. Do not fear, speak your mind. You should always pay attention to your instincts. Well then, I blurted out, it's absurd, but I suspect Miss Howard of not telling all she knows. Miss Howard? Yes, you'll laugh at me. Not at all. Why should I? I can't help feeling, I continued blunderingly, that we've rather left her out of the possible suspects, simply on the strength of her having been away from the place. But, after all, she was only 15 miles away. A car would do it in half an hour. Can we say positively that she was away from Styles on the night of the murder? Yes, my friend, said Poirot unexpectedly, we can. One of my first actions was to ring up the hospital where she was working. Well, I learnt that Miss Howard had been on afternoon duty on Tuesday, and that, a convoy coming in unexpectedly, she had kindly offered to remain on night duty, which offer was gratefully accepted. That disposes of that. Oh, I said, rather nonplussed. Really, I continued, it's her extraordinary vehemence against Inglethorp that started me off suspecting her. I can't help feeling she'd do anything against him. And I had an idea she might know something about the destroying of the will. She might have burnt the new one, mistaking it for the earlier one in his favor. She is so terribly bitter against him. You consider her vehemence unnatural? Yes. She is so very violent. I wondered really whether she is quite sane on that point. Poirot shook his head energetically. No, you are on a wrong tack there. There is nothing weak-minded or degenerate about Miss Howard. She is an excellent specimen of well-balanced English beef and brawn. She is sanity itself. Yet her hatred of Inglethorp seems almost a mania. My idea was, a very ridiculous one, no doubt that she had intended to poison him and that, in some way, Mrs. Inglethorp got hold of it by mistake. But I don't at all see how it could have been done. The whole thing is absurd and ridiculous to the last degree. Still, you are right in one thing. It is always wise to suspect everybody until you can prove logically, and to your own satisfaction, that they are innocent. Now, what reasons are there against Miss Howard's having deliberately poisoned Mrs. Inglethorp? Why, she was devoted to her, I exclaimed. Pshaw! Cried Poirot irritably. You argue like a child. If Miss Howard were capable of poisoning the old lady, she would be quite equally capable of simulating devotion. No, we must look elsewhere. You are perfectly correct in your assumption that her vehemence against Alfred Inglethorp is too violent to be natural, but you are quite wrong in the deduction you draw from it. I have drawn my own deductions, which I believe to be correct, but I will not speak of them at present. He paused a minute, then went on. Now, to my way of thinking, there is one insuperable objection to Miss Howard's being the murderess. And that is? That in no possible way could Mrs. Inglethorpe's death benefit Miss Howard. Now there is no murder without a motive. I reflected. Could not Mrs. Inglethorpe have made a will in her favor? Poirot shook his head. But you yourself suggested that possibility to Mr. Wells? Poirot smiled. That was for a reason. I did not want to mention the name of the person who was actually in my mind. Miss Howard occupied very much the same position, so I used her name instead. Still, Mrs. Inglethorpe might have done so. Why, that will, made on the afternoon of her death may. But Poirot's shake of the head was so energetic that I stopped. No, my friend. I have certain little ideas of my own about that will. But I can tell you this much, it was not in Miss Howard's favor. I accepted his assurance, though I did not really see how he could be so positive about the matter. Well, I said, with a sigh, we will acquit Miss Howard, then. It is partly your fault that I ever came to suspect her. It was what you said about her evidence at the inquest that set me off. Poirot looked puzzled. What did I say about her evidence at the inquest? Don't you remember? When I cited her and John Cavendish as being above suspicion? Oh, yes. He seemed a little confused, but recovered himself. By the way, Hastings, there is something I want you to do for me. Certainly. What is it? Next time you happen to be alone with Lawrence Cavendish, I want you to say this to him. I have a message for you, from Poirot. He says, find the extra coffee cup, and you can rest in peace. Nothing more. Nothing less. Find the extra coffee cup, and you can rest in peace. Is that right? I asked, much mystified. Excellent. But what does it mean? That I will leave you to find out. You have access to the facts. Just say that to him, and see what he says. Very well, but it's all extremely mysterious. We were running into Tadminster now, and Poirot directed the car to the analytical chemist. Poirot hopped down briskly, and went inside. In a few minutes he was back again. "There," he said. "That is all my business." "What were you doing there?" I asked, in lively curiosity. "I left something to be analyzed." "Yes, but what?" "The sample of cocoa I took from the saucepan in the bedroom." "But that has already been tested," I cried, stupefied. "Dr. Bauerstein had it tested, and you yourself laughed at the possibility of there being strychnine in it." "I know Dr. Bauerstein had it tested," replied Poirot quietly. "Well, then?" "Well, I have a fancy for having it analyzed again, that is all." And not another word on the subject could I drag out of him. This proceeding of Poirot's, in respect of the cocoa, puzzled me intensely. I could see neither rhyme nor reason in it. However, my confidence in him, which at one time had rather waned, was fully restored since his belief in Alfred Inglethorp's innocence had been so triumphantly vindicated. The funeral of Mrs. Inglethorp took place the following day, and on Monday, as I came down to a late breakfast, John drew me aside, and informed me that Mr. Inglethorp was leaving that morning, to take up his quarters at the Stylites Arms until he should have completed his plans. "And really it's a great relief to think he's going, Hastings," continued my honest friend. "It was bad enough before, when we thought he'd done it, but I'm hanged if it isn't worse now, when we all feel guilty for having been so down on the fellow. The fact is, we've treated him abominably. Of course, things did look black against him. I don't see how anyone could blame us for jumping to the conclusions we did. Still, there it is, we were in the wrong, and now there's a beastly feeling that one ought to make amends, which is difficult, when one doesn't like the fellow a bit better than one did before. The whole thing's damned awkward. And I'm thankful he's had the tact to take himself off. It's a good thing Styles wasn't the mater's to leave to him. Couldn't bear to think of the fellow lording it here. He's welcome to her money." "You'll be able to keep up the place all right?" I asked. "Oh, yes. There are the death duties, of course, but half my father's money goes with the place, and Lawrence will stay with us for the present, so there is his share as well. We shall be pinched at first, of course, because, as I once told you, I am in a bit of a hole financially myself. Still, the Johnnies will wait now." In the general relief at Inglethorpe's approaching departure, we had the most genial breakfast we had experienced since the tragedy. Cynthia, whose young spirits were naturally buoyant, was looking quite her pretty self again, and we all, with the exception of Lawrence, who seemed unalterably gloomy and nervous, were quietly cheerful, at the opening of a new and hopeful future. The papers, of course, had been full of the tragedy. Glaring headlines, sandwiched biographies of every member of the household, subtle innuendos, the usual familiar tag about the police having a clue. Nothing was spared us. It was a slack time. The war was momentarily inactive, and the newspapers seized with avidity on this crime in fashionable life. The mysterious affair at Styles was the topic of the moment. Naturally, it was very annoying for the Cavendishes. The house was constantly besieged by reporters, who were consistently denied admission, but who continued to haunt the village and the grounds, where they lay in wait with cameras, for any unwary members of the household. We all lived in a blast of publicity. The Scotland Yard men came and went, examining, questioning, lynx-eyed and reserved of tongue. Towards what end they were working, we did not know. Had they any clue, or would the whole thing remain in the category of undiscovered crimes? After breakfast, Dorcas came up to me rather mysteriously, and asked if she might have a few words with me. "Certainly. What is it, Dorcas?" "Well, it's just this, sir. You'll be seeing the Belgian gentleman today perhaps?" I nodded. "Well, sir, you know how he asked me so particular if the mistress, or anyone else, had a green dress?" Yes. You have found one?" My interest was aroused. "No, not that, sir. But since then I've remembered what the young gentleman John and Lawrence were still the young gentleman to Dorcas called the dressing-up box. It's up in the front attic, sir. A great chest, full of old clothes and fancy dresses and what not. And it came to me sudden like that there might be a green dress amongst them. So, if you tell the Belgian gentleman. I will tell him, Dorcas, I promised. Thank you very much, sir. A very nice gentleman he is, sir. And quite a different class from them two detectives from London, what goes prying about, and asking questions. I don't hold with foreigners as a rule, but from what the newspapers say I make out as how these brave Belge isn't the ordinary run of foreigners, and certainly he's a most polite-spoken gentleman. Dear old Dorcas. As she stood there, with her honest face upturned to mine, I thought what a fine specimen she was of the old-fashioned servant that is so fast dying out. I thought I might as well go down to the village at once, and look up Poirot, but I met him halfway, coming up to the house, and at once gave him Dorcas's message. Ah, the brave Dorcas. We will look at the chest, although but no matter, we will examine it all the same. We entered the house by one of the windows. There was no one in the hall, and we went straight up to the attic. Sure enough, there was the chest, a fine old piece, all studded with brass nails, and full to overflowing with every imaginable type of garment. Poirot bundled everything out on the floor with scant ceremony. There were one or two green fabrics of varying shades, but Poirot shook his head over them all. He seemed somewhat apathetic in the search, as though he expected no great results from it. Suddenly he gave an exclamation. What is it? Look. The chest was nearly empty, and there, reposing right at the bottom, was a magnificent black beard. Oh, said Poirot. Oh. He turned it over in his hands, examining it closely. New, he remarked. Yes, quite new. After a moment's hesitation, he replaced it in the chest, heaped all the other things on top of it as before, and made his way briskly downstairs. He went straight to the pantry, where we found Dorcas busily polishing her silver. Poirot wished her good morning with Gallic politeness, and went on. We have been looking through that chest, Dorcas. I am much obliged to you for mentioning it. There is, indeed, a fine collection there. Are they often used, may I ask? Well, sir, not very often nowadays, though from time to time we do have what the young gentlemen call a dress-up night. And very funny it is sometimes, sir. Mr. Lawrence, he's wonderful. Most comic. I shall never forget the night he came down as the Tsar of Persia. I think he called it a sort of Eastern king it was. He had the big paper knife in his hand, and mind, Dorcas, he says, you'll have to be very respectful. This is my specially sharpened scimitar, and it's off with your head if I'm at all displeased with you. Miss Cynthia, she was what they call an Apache, or some such name, a Frenchified sort of cutthroat, I take it to be. A real sight she looked. You'd never have believed a pretty young lady like that could have made herself into such a ruffian. Nobody would have known her. These evenings must have been great fun, said Poirot genially. I suppose Mr. Lawrence wore that fine black beard in the chest upstairs, when he was Shah of Persia? He did have a beard, sir, replied Dorcas, smiling. And well I know it, for he borrowed 2 skeins of my black wool to make it with. And I'm sure it looked wonderfully natural at a distance. I didn't know as there was a beard up there at all. It must have been got quite lately, I think. There was a red wig, I know, but nothing else in the way of hair. Burnt corks they use mostly, though 'tis messy getting it off again. Miss Cynthia was a Negro once, and, oh, the trouble she had. So Dorcas knows nothing about that black beard, said Poirot thoughtfully, as we walked out into the hall again. Do you think it is the one? I whispered eagerly. Poirot nodded. I do. You notice it had been trimmed? No. Yes. It was cut exactly the shape of Mr. Inglethorp's, and I found 1 or 2 snipped hairs. Hastings, this affair is very deep. Who put it in the chest, I wonder? Someone with a good deal of intelligence, remarked Poirot dryly. You realize that he chose the one place in the house to hide it where its presence would not be remarked? Yes, he is intelligent. But we must be more intelligent. We must be so intelligent that he does not suspect us of being intelligent at all. I acquiesced. There, mon ami, you will be of great assistance to me. I was pleased with the compliment. There had been times when I hardly thought that Poirot appreciated me at my true worth. Yes, he continued, staring at me thoughtfully, you will be invaluable. This was naturally gratifying, but Poirot's next words were not so welcome. I must have an ally in the house, he observed reflectively. You have me, I protested. True, but you are not sufficient. I was hurt, and showed it. Poirot hurried to explain himself. You do not quite take my meaning. You are known to be working with me. I want somebody who is not associated with us in any way. Oh, I see. How about John? No, I think not. The dear fellow isn't perhaps very bright, I said thoughtfully. Here comes Miss Howard, said Poirot suddenly. She is the very person. But I am in her black books, since I cleared Mr. Inglethorp. Still, we can but try. With a nod that was barely civil, Miss Howard assented to Poirot's request for a few minutes' conversation. We went into the little morning room, and Poirot closed the door. Well, Monsieur Poirot, said Miss Howard impatiently, what is it? Out with it. I'm busy. Do you remember, Mademoiselle, that I once asked you to help me? Yes, I do. The lady nodded. And I told you I'd help you with pleasure to hang Alfred Inglethorp. Ah. Poirot studied her seriously. Miss Howard, I will ask you one question. I beg of you to reply to it truthfully. Never tell lies, replied Miss Howard. It is this. Do you still believe that Mrs. Inglethorp was poisoned by her husband? What do you mean? She asked sharply. You needn't think your pretty explanations influence me in the slightest. I'll admit that it wasn't he who bought strychnine at the chemist's shop. What of that? I dare say he soaked fly paper, as I told you at the beginning. That is arsenic, not strychnine, said Poirot mildly. What does that matter? Arsenic would put poor Emily out of the way just as well as strychnine. If I'm convinced he did it, it doesn't matter a jot to me how he did it. Exactly. If you are convinced he did it, said Poirot quietly, I will put my question in another form. Did you ever in your heart of hearts believe that Mrs. Inglethorp was poisoned by her husband? Good heavens! Cried Miss Howard. Haven't I always told you the man is a villain? Haven't I always told you he would murder her in her bed? Haven't I always hated him like poison? Exactly, said Poirot. That bears out my little idea entirely. What little idea? Miss Howard, do you remember a conversation that took place on the day of my friend's arrival here? He repeated it to me, and there is a sentence of yours that has impressed me very much. Do you remember affirming that if a crime had been committed, and anyone you loved had been murdered, you felt certain that you would know by instinct who the criminal was, even if you were quite unable to prove it? Yes, I remember saying that. I believe it too. I suppose you think it nonsense? Not at all. And yet you will pay no attention to my instinct against Alfred Inglethorp. No, said Poirot curtly. Because your instinct is not against Mr. Inglethorp. What? No. You wish to believe he committed the crime. You believe him capable of committing it. But your instinct tells you he did not commit it. It tells you more. Shall I go on? She was staring at him, fascinated, and made a slight affirmative movement of the hand. Shall I tell you why you have been so vehement against Mr. Inglethorp? It is because you have been trying to believe what you wish to believe. It is because you are trying to drown and stifle your instinct, which tells you another name. No, 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 cried Miss Howard wildly, flinging up her hands. Don't say it. Oh, don't say it. It isn't true. It can't be true. I don't know what put such a wild, such a dreadful idea into my head. I am right, am I not? Asked Poirot. Yes, yes, you must be a wizard to have guessed. But it can't be so, it's too monstrous, too impossible. It must be Alfred Inglethorp. Poirot shook his head gravely. Don't ask me about it, continued Miss Howard, because I shan't tell you. I won't admit it, even to myself. I must be mad to think of such a thing. Poirot nodded, as if satisfied. I will ask you nothing. It is enough for me that it is as I thought. And I, too, have an instinct. We are working together towards a common end. Don't ask me to help you, because I won't. I wouldn't lift a finger to, she faltered. You will help me in spite of yourself. I ask you nothing but you will be my ally. You will not be able to help yourself. You will do the only thing that I want of you. And that is? You will watch. Evelyn Howard bowed her head. Yes, I can't help doing that. I am always watching, always hoping I shall be proved wrong. If we are wrong, well and good, said Poirot. No one will be more pleased than I shall. But, if we are right? If we are right, Miss Howard, on whose side are you then? I don't know. Come now. It could be hushed up. There must be no hushing up. But Emily herself she broke off. Miss Howard, said Poirot gravely, this is unworthy of you. Suddenly she took her face from her hands. Yes, she said quietly, that was not Evelyn Howard who spoke. She flung her head up proudly. This is Evelyn Howard. And she is on the side of justice. Let the cost be what it may. And with these words, she walked firmly out of the room. There, said Poirot, looking after her, goes a very valuable ally. That woman, Hastings, has got brains as well as a heart. I did not reply. Instinct is a marvelous thing, mused Poirot. It can neither be explained nor ignored. You and Miss Howard seem to know what you are talking about, I observed coldly. Perhaps you don't realize that I am still in the dark. Really? Is that so, mon ami? Yes. Enlighten me, will you? Poirot studied me attentively for a moment or two. Then, to my intense surprise, he shook his head decidedly. No, my friend. Oh, look here, why not? 2 is enough for a secret. Well, I think it is very unfair to keep back facts from me. I am not keeping back facts. Every fact that I know is in your possession. You can draw your own deductions from them. This time it is a question of ideas. Still, it would be interesting to know. Poirot looked at me very earnestly, and again shook his head. You see, he said sadly, you have no instincts. It was intelligence you were requiring just now, I pointed out. The two often go together, said Poirot enigmatically. The remark seemed so utterly irrelevant that I did not even take the trouble to answer it. But I decided that if I made any interesting and important discoveries, as no doubt I should, I would keep them to myself, and surprise Poirot with the ultimate result. There are times when it is one's duty to assert oneself. Chapter 9 Dr. Bauerstein. I had had no opportunity as yet of passing on Poirot's message to Lawrence. But now, as I strolled out on the lawn, still nursing a grudge against my friend's high-handedness, I saw Lawrence on the croquet lawn, aimlessly knocking a couple of very ancient balls about, with a still more ancient mallet. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I really hoped you enjoyed it. There will be more to come. Please subscribe not to miss out on what is next. I will be looking forward to your return. The music is by Madfan from Pixabay. To support this and other artists, go to pixabay.com. Sheila.